Well, thank you very much, Larry, and thanks everybody for being here. I just got to get my window shared. All right, are folks able to see this?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And is my head floating on it, or is that just on my screen?
Your head's floating on my screen.
Yeah, it's in the corner.
Okay, well, we don't need my face to be floating like that, I don't think. So we'll just do it like that. Great. Yeah, I don't think I can see the chat or anything like that. The only thing I can see right now is my presentation. So we're just going to go ahead. If folks have questions, of course, we can check that at the end. But yeah, I'm just going to go ahead with it. So yeah, thanks everybody for hosting me again. I have a little bit of a cough, so I'm sorry if I get into a coughing fit, but I think I should do okay with my cup of tea and all here. And yeah, as Larry said, the title of my talk is Unbelievably Deep, a Reanalysis of the Hells Midden Site. And go to the next slide here. This just gives basically an outline of what my presentation is going to be about. So first, I'll just give some general remarks about the site, the environmental setting, where the heck in the world is Hells Midden, and all of these kind of things. And then the majority of my talk is going to be focused on the history of the investigations at this site and at other indigenous archaeological sites along the Yampa Canyon within Dinosaur National Monument. And this area was pretty thoroughly studied by the University of Colorado, and that's where all the collections are currently housed that I'll be reanalyzing. And so this is the first talk I've given on this topic. I thought that the Boulder chapter would really like to hear some of this historical piece. So I'm going to lead with that, and that's going to be the bulk of the talk. And then I'll talk a little bit about the material culture, what's actually there at the site. And then the last third or so of my presentation is going to talk about some of the methods that I'm planning to use, that I've begun to use on the reanalysis of this collection. So I'm still in the midst of reanalyzing the materials from this site. So I hope if this talk is well received and I'm not booed off stage or something like that, that I can give y'all a follow-up talk sometime next year about some of the results that my work produces. Okay, so Hells Midden. This big white Google Earth square, you can see that's the state of Colorado. So the site's located in Moffat County, the most northwestern county in the state there. And this little inset map shows a portion of the Yampa River. You can see, I don't think I have a pointer, but just near that pin on the inset map, and then to the west, you can see a kind of broad, low-lying area along the river, and this is called Castle Park. This area is about 5 miles upstream of the Yampa's confluence with the Green River. And this map, this is an illustration from Bob Lister's report on the site. And this shows some of the major archaeological sites that have been studied in this area. And it has that little cutaway map there too. So certainly the most famous site here is Mantles Cave. Many folks have heard about. Marigold's Cave also. These are some dry rock shelter deposits that have just incredible perishable materials, and we'll look at some of those in a little while. But some of the other sites that have been investigated, you can see here, Rat Midden, Hell's Half Acre, and Hells Midden there, just right at the mouth of Hell's Canyon, coming in from the east. So, yeah, I'm a second-year grad student, and I had to, a little year ago or so, I had to come up with a thesis project, and so I was just reading all kinds of things, and the deposits at Mantles Cave really intrigued me. And I started reading about some of the other sites in the area, and in the 1948 report that the University of Colorado Museum produced from this work, I found this quote that you can see there. And it says, "For volume and depth of occupational debris, Hell's Midden is unrivaled in the Yampa Canyon. Although less dramatic than the cave sites, It is of major importance for chronological control in this region, and its excavation should be considered as the first objective in future archaeological work. Up to now, it's only been tested, but the yield is so rich that even this limited sampling has been of value for the interpretation of other sites. And they go on in this report to talk about Hell's Midden and some of the other kind of unique features about it, but it was really this depth of occupational history. It's almost more than 4 meters of cultural deposits at this site. And the fact that almost all the other archaeological sites that University of Colorado was studying here in Castle Park, they were all primarily Fremont in age, or so that's quite late. You know, the late prehistoric period is roughly about 1000 AD, give or take. Um, and previous periods of occupation are not well known in this area. So it's not really understood how folks transitioned into sedentary lifeways or into the kind of real elaborate material culture that we see with Fremont occupation. Um, we also don't know, how farming came to be practiced because the Fremont were corn farmers down in this river canyon, but it's unclear to us if this is the story of the Neolithic revolution that we've all heard about, that corn showed up and all of a sudden people are sedentary and making ceramics and things like this. So I really kind of wanted to look at some of these questions with my research. So this arrow, this is just a different view of the Hells Midden site. This is looking south on Google Earth. You can see on the left-hand side of the screen Hell's Canyon coming into the Yampa Valley there. You can see some large tilled fields. This is part of the Mantles Ranch right there. And then at the base of that little bluff, there's at this scale, it looks small, but there's a little rise at the base of this bluff that is Hell's Midden. And it's beneath a small rock shelter. Um, and frankly, that's a generous term. It's not, but maybe 2 meters deep. We'll show pictures of that in a little while. But Hell's Midden is this persistently reoccupied place on the landscape. And the reasons for that are obviously probably many-fold, but I think the low relief that Castle Park offers, access to year-round water that the Yampa offers there, this would have attracted all kinds of game critters. It would have led to certain plants growing in the region. And all of these things would have been attractors to human occupation here, right? The one thing I just want to point out, Hell's Midden is actually not a midden. Um, the earliest investigations at the site thought that this probably was a midden and that there was a larger village site or some kind of occupation site on that terrace just above the main floodplain down there. And they thought all this debris had just accumulated from people tossing their trash over the edge of this cliff, right? So we're kind of stuck with that name Hell's Midden, but as we'll see in the deposits, we have features that give really good evidence for the use of this site as a primary occupation. We have hearth features, some things that look like they might be cysts or like caching pits, and then hard-packed living floors. All of these saying that people were more than likely, or clearly here, living beneath this rock shelter and not just simply throwing their waste into this hill, onto this midden. Okay, so now the environmental section. So this is considered the semi-arid benchlands and canyon lands. You can see that cut out, that little map at the bottom right there. So this is an area that experiences extreme aridity. Even though the rates of precipitation are relatively high for desert landscapes, the amount of evaporation here classifies this area as a high desert. So you have very hot summers, very cold winters, and the growing season here is quite short, which is important when we're starting to think about Fremont occupants of the canyon doing their corn farming and things like this, right? It's probable that places like Castle Park and these low-lying areas did offer some relief from some of the frost and things that areas afflicted by wind at higher elevation and that would have suffered. So we might have gotten a few more growing days out of the year. But, just take that to be very marginal kind of landscapes to be doing corn agriculture in. It's clear that they were doing it here. But it's kind of interesting, relative to some of the areas south and west of here, how really unfavorable this climate is. The other thing to note just about the general environment is the soil characteristics. So given that it's this benchlands and canyonlands, the tops of the river canyons and the topographic highs really do not have much soil at all. They're heavily erosional environments, and any dirt that's sediments and sands, soils that are coming off those topographic highs are all being washed down into the river bottoms. And so these river bottoms have quite rich alluvial soils that would have been favorable to corn farming, also favorable to the preservation of sites, right? And you don't have this in the higher areas. Okay, so now we'll talk about the bulk of my presentation here, which is going to focus on the history of investigations. So there were 4 primary field seasons that the University of Colorado Museum carried out within Castle Park. So you can see the dates there and the kind of PIs on those projects, or the people in charge during those projects. So we'll go through each of those in turn. This photo here is from the 1948 field school. So the last 2 seasons down here actually were field schools. We had that quote from Berg earlier saying that archaeological investigation of Hell's Midden should be primary importance, should be the first thing they do. And that report was written in 1948, and you can see they followed that in very quick order with 2 field schools conducted at the site and some of the neighboring sites as well. So the first season of excavation was in the winter of 1939 and 1940. And this was conducted by Charles Scoggin and Edison Lohr. Ed Lohr can be seen in the photo here, kind of at center right, holding a big stadia rod. And the midden is there just behind him, off and to the left behind him there. You can see how shallow that shelter is, how overgrown that midden is with vegetation and that. But so this first investigation took place, like I say, it was the winter of 39 to 40. It was December 12th to May 30th that these pair of young 20-somethings, they were just students, they were sent out to the canyon to do some archaeological reconnaissance. They were sent out there after a couple of men from Boulder had found some really incredible perishable materials from Mantles Cave. They dug up a cache pit, and we'll see photos of that in a little while. But they dug up a cache pit and brought it back to Boulder, and they thought this stuff is so incredible that they actually donated it, turned over the materials to Earl Morris, who at the time was living in Boulder and working at the museum there. Earl Morris thought, wow, these are like some incredible artifacts. And he in turn donated them to the museum. And just later that year, those artifacts were donated, I believe, in October of that year. And by December, they had set up permissions with the Mantles family to send these 2 students out. So Robert Berg, who was the assistant to the director at the museum, he tapped Charles Scoggin to do this work. And he told Scoggin, pick another student that you'd like to bring with you, and we'll pay for you guys to be out there the entire season. It's pretty incredible for this 6 months of work. Chili Scoggin was paid $60, and Ed Lohr was paid $40, on top of course, all their expenses. But they got to spend a winter just doing incredible archaeology along the Yampa Canyon. And we'll look at some of those pictures in a moment. But so I've been doing a lot of archival work as part of this research, and this is a quote from Chili Scoggin's journal, right? And he's talking about how the Mantle set them up, how incredible it'll be to start doing work. And then, this is on the first day they arrived there, he says, this evening before dark, Ed and I came upon a 12-foot midden deposit at the mouth of Hell Canyon. not 50 feet from Mantles Place, unseen, perhaps unrecognized is the better adjective, by anyone before, which is a treasure chest to be sure. Our first artifacts are from there. So this was cool. This was really gave me chills when I was reading this because I'd already started doing research on Hells Midden and realizing that they recognized the potential of this the day they showed up in the canyon. And it's true. We have the first 8 artifacts that are cataloged by these paraboys from the Yampa Canyon comes from Hells Midden. And so it was one of the first sites they actually identified, but it was quite later when they actually got to digging it. It was one of the last sites they actually dug there. Like I say, their main focus was on the Mantles Cave. So this shows some of the artifacts from Mantles Cave. It is just these incredible perishable materials, right? So at the top left, we have the flicker feather headdress. I'm sure some of y'all in the audience have got a chance to see this. This is, I would argue, among the most famous artifacts in the state of Colorado because it is just so stunning and so well preserved. It's all these flicker feathers, probably from more than 150 birds, ermine fur there along the base. Really incredible thing. We also have this deer scalp headdress with the ears sticking straight up. And then all these snares, fishing hooks, and things like that you can see on the bottom right. And all of these things are just so wickedly well preserved. When they were found, they were inside these cache pits at Mantles Cave. Mantles Cave is just massive. I mean, multiple football fields inside. It is a huge rock shelter. And these pair of boys spent the majority of their winter digging at that site. And when they came down to these levels with these cache pits, you can see Ed Lohr here removing a rock, which was placed on top of a basket, which was placed on top of these stone-lined cists. So really incredible architectural features for storing some of these materials. You know, it's a bit of a mystery why all these things were left behind, particularly since, I mean, the utilitarian things maybe we could get, but where some of these things look to be certainly ritualistic or have some special significance to the people who cache them there, right? So materials from this cave have been dated, and they line up right about the 10th century, so the mid to late 900s or so. The exception is this deerskin headdress, which actually dates 2,000 years prior to that, and it's been multiply dated, and both times it's come back. That's still being debated what exactly that means, but yeah, so that's where they spent most of their winter. That's yeah, that winter. Um, and it really wasn't until some of the museum executives came to the site or came to visit them at the Mantles Ranch that they actually were encouraged to dig at Hell's Midden. Um, Kind of like me, Chili Scoggin was sort of sick when the museum staff was down there, and you can read in his journal he's quite embarrassed about this fact. He's obviously really trying to impress these archaeologists, and he feels bad that he's so ill. But he notes in his journal that Earl Morris said Hell's Midden was perhaps the most impressive deposit in the region that he'd seen. Right. And this next line, hope that Ed and I have time to give it some good inspection. It's not clear if Chili hoped they had time or if Earl Morris wanted them to have time. But in any case, that was on the 3rd of May. They only had a month, less than a month down in the canyon, but they did spend some time excavating at the site. So here's a before photo. Again, Ed Lohr standing in the background there. And here is the after photo. They dug, you can see they focused entirely beneath the rock shelter itself. Um, they dug about, you can see about 6 feet down into these deposits. And notice there, though, to the left of Ed Lohr's, to our left of Ed Lohr's thigh there, you can see some pretty well intact stratigraphy, which was pretty incredible. You know, and unfortunately, provenience records on this field season are pretty poor. So we don't actually have good association with a lot of the artifacts. And I think the reason being at Mantles Cave, they didn't find any kind of stratigraphic variability. It was basically these cache pits and these Fremont horizons with very little other materials. which predated or underlaid any of these deposits. So here, I mean, they did this work, just Chili and Ed did this work over 2 days. So they really were moving dirt. Um, so if there was stratigraphic control, those records have been lost, probably in the preparation of the 1948 report. Um, but we do have the artifacts, and some of them are just stunning, and we'll get to those in a little while. So in 1947, University of Colorado returned to the site. You can see their field camp here from that year. Um, and this was done just to test prior to the field schools that would take place the next 2 years, and also prior to the publication of the manuscript that Berg and Scoggin would write posthumously. I forgot to mention, I failed to mention, um, Chili Scoggin was actually killed in World War II. He was drafted and sent out and was killed in 1944. Um, he had a daughter. He actually has some living descendants working in Boulder today. Um, and he never actually got to meet his child. Um, and so he never got to be a part of the reporting on this site either. But he was given posthumous credit by Robert Berg on the report. So anyhow, Berg goes to the site in 47, and he brings along a couple of National Park Service archaeologists, folks who became pretty well known in Great Basin and Colorado Plateau archaeology, Jesse Nussbaum and Jesse Jennings. It's actually in correspondence with Jesse Nussbaum, between Nussbaum and Berg, that the title of my talk derives, that unbelievably deep. That was how they qualified these deposits in a correspondence. During this field season, they just did some limiting testing at Hells Midden. They actually employed um, some of the Mantles kids who lived down here at the ranch to help them screening materials and things like that. Seems like they got a kick doing that. And their excavations primarily focused on the outside of the shelter. So you can see here their stratigraphic profile. They identified these 4 cultural horizons, right? Um, Interlaying with these apparently sterile sand lenses. This is quite simplified compared to what's the later field work found. But when you're working in such a limited trench, you know it's to be kind of expected for that stuff. So here is the crew at work. We have Robert Berg on the far left there, um, warming his hands over the fire. This figure in the middle, I believe, is Hugo Rodek, who was the director at the museum. And I've not yet been able to identify who this third is, but I suspect is one of the Park Service archaeologists. At the far right, you can see their trench, quite narrow. This may be a meter, but it's a pretty narrow meter if so. But you can see they dug down um, fairly deep into these deposits until they hit apparently sterile horizons at the very lowest. So the next year, field school returned. You can see the dates for that there. Robert Berg, who was assistant to the director, was in charge of excavations along with Robert Lister, who was to be the instructor of archaeology to the students there. In the archival record at the University of Colorado, we actually have the flyer that was used, distributed to students, advertising this field school. Tuition was $150. You're expected to bring your own camp gear, and so that was kind of a cool piece of history to see. This field school dug both at Hells Midden and at Marigold's Cave, which is another dry deposit further down the river that has some pretty incredible architectural features inside of it. They also did some limited testing at these sites mentioned here. Particularly important to our study here is their testing at Hell's Half Acre. So that's the name for that terrace site that's just above the Midden that Berg and others speculated was the primary occupation area, and that the Hell's Midden was just accumulated trash from this top. So they tested up there, but they actually found very little suggesting that Hell's Half Acre was a occupation site. And so that get as well as the evidence they found in their profiles suggested to them that Hell's Midden was a primary occupation. You can see here a cache of hand stones that were found at considerable depth, probably late archaic in age. And we'll get back to those in a little while. So this shows the beginning of excavations at Hell's Midden. You can see there's a ditch that this is an irrigation ditch used by the Mantles family that runs along the base of the midden. Surely this ditch destabilized the midden in some ways, but also probably was one of the factors that led to the discovery of this site, right? Seeing these artifacts eroding out of the banks here. So they built this little ramp for their wheelbarrows. You can see the screener down there at bottom right. So here we're about a meter into these deposits. You can see some pretty incredible stratigraphy, even showing up in these black and white photos, which you don't always get, right? There's a historic horizon. We're starting to get into these Fremont horizons down here. Further along. This field season definitely has, I would say, the best provenience data, as well as the best photographic and archival data of this site. Yeah, they did a really, really good job recording some of these things. And here we are getting very deep into the site, several meters down, and you can see on the left this student looking down at this wall fall that just happened, what they called a cave in. Oh, their entire profile just demolished, probably just one sloppy stroke of the shovel or something like that made this whole wall just collapse. And you can see somebody, an elder gentleman, coming over with a wheelbarrow, and the student just looking so disappointed that that had happened. Uh, but luckily, it didn't happen before they got these killer profiles done. So you can see here their excavation methodology. In the first couple of levels, they really stuck to natural stratigraphic levels, or what they saw as natural levels. So levels 2 and 3 are where the majority of these Fremont age deposits are, or presumably Fremont age deposits, I should say, just based on the artifacts, the presence of corn and ceramics. Those are in those upper levels there. These lower levels, as you go down, we have cultural material at a fair density down to level 11. Which is approximately 400 centimeters below the surface there, right? Our absolute deepest artifact is from level 13 at the kind of bottom of this trench. We have a stone bowl. How it got introduced to such a depth is kind of curious. We'll be trying to sort some of that out. But then another really interesting thing, we have the Pat Lynch horizon up top, which we'll talk about in a little while. Okay, so the next year, field school returned. This time, Herb Dick was the instructor. Herbert Dick was taken from the Peabody Museum and came to work at the University of Colorado. He succeeded Berg in his role as assistant to the director. And reading some of the archival bits, it seems like there was some controversy around Berg's leaving that I haven't quite been able to sort out, but I hope to get to the bottom of it. Where Berg just says, in this very polite 1940s kind of way that, oh, he was quite displeased with the way things went at the museum or something like that. So not quite sure what happened there, but yeah, Berg did not work there anymore. And during this field season, they were really focused on moving west of that trench that was dug by Lister and his crew in 48. And they just really dug a big block below that shelter. Right. Here, their methodology changed somewhat. They switched to 12-inch arbitrary levels, which complicates things in the reanalysis, or in the other side, they were digging in 30-centimeter levels. So teasing those and getting artifacts to correspond across these two different level designations has been kind of taking up a bulk of this work just making sure that we're clear on where everything's coming from in the site. So here's a couple of photos. You can see how deep they dug during these excavations. I've not been able to tell what exactly the student is pointing at on the right. Probably a stratigraphic level. It could be an artifact in situ, but we just don't have the resolution to see, but that's kind of interesting there. So that's a rough overview of the history of investigations. So now we'll talk about, well, what the heck did they find, right? This is the really interesting stuff. So here I've supplemented some photos that I've taken in my reanalysis here. They're not cleaned up, so excuse me for that. But I have photos, and those are right alongside some of the illustrations that were used in Lister's 1951 report. So the point types that we see here, well, first of all, the chipstone assemblage is just incredibly rich. In those upper Fremont Horizons, just in those two levels, we have over 7,000 chipstone debris or flakes, debitage, right? Somewhat luckily for me, because I don't have to reanalyze them all, but also difficult because they could tell us quite a lot. None of that debitage was apparently collected. So it was either reburied at the site or Bob Lister, ran off with it like those old cowboy archaeologists would sometimes do with their collections. I'm not really sure where that stuff has ended up. But the nice thing is I'm only left then with formal tools. We have over 900 formal tools that have been recovered from this site, right? Projectile point typologies, broadly grouped into the kind of three main types, with a fourth that I'm still trying to type. So you can see at the center right, these kind of large corner notch atlatl darts. These are probably the oldest points in the deposit, right? Then following that, you have Mallory or McKean types, which are these kind of squared base with the indentations there. You can see a photo at the bottom right and an illustration just to the left of that. So these are most like Mallory types, which is a type that has a pretty broad temporal range from Middle Archaic and on. Similarly, we have Pinto point types, which you can see that's these rabbit ear looking dudes to the left of that Mallory illustration, and they're again at the top right of the screen. Again, these have incredible long duration in the archaeological record of the Great Basin and Colorado Plateau. So getting some dates on these horizons will really be interesting to see when these point types were being used in this part of the Colorado Plateau. And then rose gate varieties. These are these small, very fine arrow points that you can see in the center of all those photos there. Often these are built on flakes and are actually very minimally touched along their edge to get them into a point shape, right? They're not bifacially worked in many cases, right? One interesting thing about all these projectile points is that based on neck width alone, which is where you measure, the little hafting area of these projectile points, atlatl use apparently persisted coincidentally with bow and arrow use. So both technologies were being used through time, which is not something you see in a lot of the record of North America. So that's kind of interesting, that could be explained by some of these larger hafted points actually being knives or some other kind of tool. Still kind of interesting, so we'll be looking at some of that too. Other artifacts we see are snub-nosed scrapers. It's kind of classic, unifacially worked little thumbnail scrapers. We also have turtleback scrapers, which are big bifaces with the majority of their mass above one edge. And these could have been used for an earlier stage of hide working or something like this. Right. Other tools that would have been used for hide working that we have are things like drills and gravers. Um, we also have choppers and formal knives in the collection, as well as a variety of utilized flake tools and edge modified flakes. The utilized flake tools we especially see in the later horizons, in the Fremont occupations and that, which is something that we expect with more sedentary populations, that they'd be more keen on just carrying around cores and breaking off flakes and using those as kind of expedient tools, um, relative to hunter-gatherer folks who are highly mobile would have been using more bifacial technology. So some of that's going to play into my interpretations of sedentism at the site. Other things they found are just tons of organic material and rare artifact types. You can see these bone pendants up at the top right. Yeah, so these are just drilled and worked and shaped, smoothed down, totally flat. Um, the one on the right is actually, it's in two pieces now in the collection. I presume it was excavated that way. This is probably just reconstructed. Because it does refit, but it's this totally blackened bone where somehow they either dyed it with the charcoal or they somehow burned it and controlled the burning carefully. But it's pretty neat to see. The function of that, unknown, but it's incredible and speaks to just this fluorescence of material culture in these later time periods. Awls are another thing we see tons of. Um, and presumably there would have been sewing needles, but using quarter-inch screens, you're not real likely to find sewing needles. But awls speak to a lot of hide or clothing production, or probably a lot of other uses as well, that we may not know about. So there's, yeah, a total of 50 awls in the collection. Bone pendants and dice. Um, Dice, there are tons of. I don't have a count right offhand, but I would say dozens of these dice. Um, and these are basically small segments of long bone that have been ground down, and the interior then coated in ochre, right? So these could have been played in a game of chance or a game of gambling of some kind where the dice could be thrown and you get this kind of binary answer. So that's pretty neat to see that. And that mirrors some of the other Fremont sites in Castle Park, which also have these. Bone tubes could have been part of jewelry, could have also been part of a slip, like a noose snare. So that's something that we've seen at other Fremont sites. One of the coolest artifacts is this stone pipe, which this was actually found during Chili Scoggins season. You can see his initials there where he illustrated this stone pipe. And that is just such a cool artifact. It's probably 5 centimeters long at present, obviously broken there, but really neat to see this pipe, right? And then ceramics, we have this one reconstructed vessel and probably sherds from four or so other vessels, right? So trying to understand the distribution, Bob Lister compiled this stuff into this sort of seriograph here. This was a photo actually that Christian found and used to advertise this talk, which is just stellar. You can see all the different artifact types that they have and the way that he was trying to understand toolkits and how that changed through time. So he saw three hunting gatherer stages in the site at Hells Midden, and one horticultural stage up top, which comprised those levels 2 and 3. And the horticultural phase could have been, inferred probably from some of the groundstone tools, from the ceramic, some of the other things you're seeing. But what's really cool is this site actually has yielded corn, so that'll give us an opportunity to date corn farming in this region. You can get really good radiocarbon dates off of corn. So that's something we hope to do. And note they mentioned textiles. There was actually textiles here, which were really, really well preserved. So here I just kind of summarize some of those points, things that I just went over. One of the more well, I wouldn't say more interesting things. It's definitely secondary to anything I'm looking at. But what's wild is that there is actually a historic horizon at Hell's Midden that's attributed to Patrick Lynch, who was the hermit of Pat's Hole. Was uh, he was an old Irishman who moved to the United States in late 1850s. He joined the military, and during the Civil War, he served in the Navy, but he got discharged, so he re-enlisted under a new name. right? In the 1870s, he made his way to this area of northwestern Colorado, northeastern Utah, and he roamed the canyons and lived here for the rest of his days. For about 50 years, he lived in dry caves along the Yampa and the Green and some of these other rivers. And he would carve his name all over the place and draw these ships. You can see a charcoal drawing of a ship there. Um, so that's just really, really kind of interesting. Uh, and his horizon actually had preserved newspaper, so we can very accurately date his occupation there to sometime just around 1882, based on the dates on the newspaper. Right. It also looks like he was making bullets at the site. Um, that's just all pretty neat, I think. The fact that this newspaper, tin cans and things like this, some of this actually preserved, right? Um, yeah, and then just some general remarks about the other thing. Most significant, I would say, is these features that we see. This hard packed earth and fire reddened soils right around these hearth features, right in those Fremont horizons. Further down, what's quite interesting, levels 6 and 7, you can see there, they've found a cache of 5 monos, right? So this gives some indication about how the site may have been used in these pre-sedentary times, right? That, like I mentioned way at the beginning of the talk, there's probably certain plant species that are present here along the Yampa that would have been highly attractive and suitable for folks. Um, Plants of economy there, things they would have wanted to eat, like perhaps Yampa that the river's named after, right? Some wild carrot and things like that is known to grow along that bottom. And so finding these cache of monos kind of speaks to um, a provisioning of a site, right? These folks being highly mobile probably wouldn't have wanted to carry around all these monos, but the fact that they left them there suggests they probably will return on a seasonal basis or other kind of cyclical kind of nature to come and take advantage of these plants growing there, right? And then I just mentioned here, yeah, that deepest artifact, another stone ball within level 13. So trying to sort that out. Um, Being that it's further away from the rock shelter, it could be that it just somehow made its way through the soils down to the bottom. We're going to try to get a good hold on that. So this is the way that these things were interpreted by Berg and Scoggin, as well as Robert Lister. Um, they found these upper horizons matched almost perfectly some of the sites, the other Fremont sites that were found in Castle Park. The ceramics, the textiles, the corn, all matched, right? These things have been dated, like I say, in the 90s and early 2000s. We've got radiocarbon dates from Mantles that show it right about the year 1000. The only dates they had available to them were dendrochronology dates, and that put using a timber from a house at Marigold's Cave. It was about the mid 9th century AD, so pretty much in that range. Could be a century or 2 centuries of Fremont occupation along the region, along the Castle Park area there. But the real significant piece about Hell's Midden is that these pre-Fremont horizons, these archaic age things, pre-formative occupations, there are really no other sites in the region that speak to this. None in Castle Park, and they're pretty few and far between elsewhere. Probably a big piece of that is just that these are more ephemeral occupations, and so they're harder to see for one. Another factor, of course, is that Fremont is just kind of sexy, and that a lot of people have been wanting to study these really incredible, these rich and abundant material cultures that the Fremont folks left behind, leaving some of this other stuff to be unstudied. But so Hell's Midden gives us a really good chance to look at what these other occupations at the site, um, what they looked like. Right. So now I'm going to go into the methodology that I'm going to be using for this reanalysis, right? I have two primary questions for my reanalysis of the site. The first is, how old are these deposits, right? Until we get that, we can't really tie it to the regional chronology of indigenous occupation. So it's really important to know how old is this stuff, right? So we have some previous estimations, and I'm going to be using these certainly for hypothesis building, even though it's pretty limited in, probably its reality and practicality. But Lister estimated the age of the deposits using rate of accumulation. So he assumed that sediments on the site were going to be building at a more or less constant rate. Okay. So what he did was he looked at the Pat Lynch horizon. He said, okay, that's the 1880s, right? He looked at the Fremont horizon and going off that Marigold's Cave date, he said, okay, that's the late 800s, right? So we have 1,000-year spread between the Pat Lynch horizon at top and the Fremont horizons there just below. The amount of sediment between these two horizons is approximately 50 centimeters, right? So we divide 1,000 years, 50 centimeters, and we get an accumulation rate of approximately 1 centimeter every 20 years, right? So if that were true, and we look at 400 centimeters of occupation at the site, we can estimate that those deepest occupational levels would have been about 8,000 years old. Right. Lister didn't seem too taken with this date. He thought that was probably too early. And I agree. I think that's probably a little early, even though it's soon to tell because we don't have absolute dates back. So he posited a second measure where he said, okay, so we have Fremont from other areas in Utah and the state, right? And these have been dated to a period of about 400 to 800 AD. Okay. I'll tell you that's not current Fremont dates. That's just what they had available to them at the time. Anyhow, so 400 to 800 AD, that's 400 years. And these two Fremont horizons are approximately a meter thick, right? So again, we run that same calculation and we get 1 centimeter of sediment laid down every 4 years, right? Okay, well, this much quicker rate of deposition been much later, right? If this hypothetical is taken as true. So he suggested an earliest age of about 1500 BC for these lowest deposits, right? So that's what I'm going to hope to be testing. Luckily for us, we have radiocarbon. So we can actually absolutely date these deposits with pretty fair accuracy. We should be able to get plus or minus, 30 years or so on these dates because there is so much bone at this site. I didn't mention that earlier, but there's over 2,400 fragments of bone. Excuse me. It's a ridiculous number of bone. Yeah, 2,500 pieces of bone. So lots of bone to choose from. And so what I'm hoping to do, you can see here, I'm focusing all my stuff on the south end of the site, nearest to the rock shelter wall, because as you can see with these stratigraphic profiles, that's where the integrity is the best, where we can assume soils, bones, things like that are moving around the least. So my focus is going to be to date these very lowest levels of occupation at the site, right? Date the Fremont horizons up top. Let's try to get a date on both of those to see how far separated in time these two horizons are, right? Is there a big span of abandonment between two horticultural stages? Or is there just a lot of dirt coming from environmental reasons or something else, right? And then I'm going to try to split my dates throughout the horizon. So I'm shooting for 10 dates overall, and I think we're just working on our last piece of funding, but I think we're going to be able to get all those 10 dates for this site. And we should be able to figure out how old these deposits are. So that question is pretty straightforward. The second question, trying to understand the degree of sedentism that folks express at this site. That's a little harder, a little more nuanced of an interpretation, but we're going to go right into it, right? Again, this is important because we want to see how were these archaic folks, did they experience semi-sedentism during certain times of the year where they're hanging out at the Yampa Canyon during the winter, staying warm and doing this. Did that mean that corn and these things that require you to hang out for a while actually slot pretty easily in to indigenous lifeways there? Or did sedentism not really exist until, was it all short-term occupation and high mobility until corn came around? So that's what we're going to try to get at. So basically, I have two primary assumptions for measuring sedentism, right? The first is that more mobile people are going to carry less stuff, right? That just makes sense. What we expect in hunter-gatherers is that they're going to have a very conservative toolkits, and they're going to have a good idea when they produce a tool, what the kind of life use of that tool is going to be. They kind of project into the future a little bit. So they produce a biface, right? And okay, for a little while, I'm going to carry this around and I'll just use it to knock flakes off of until it gets to a small enough piece, right? Where now I'm going to turn it into a projectile point. Okay, great. We're going to use this projectile point. We're going to go hunt some elk. Okay, great. We killed that elk. Now I have the base of a projectile point. Okay, well, now I need to process this hide. So I'm going to work this projectile point base into a scraper. We're going to scrape the hide. Okay, great. Now I need a drill. So let me work this down a little bit more. And there's this whole sequence of reduction in their stone tools that you kind of expect to see for highly mobile folks, right? And this is because they're following the herds. They're following plants. They're going to visit relatives, do all of these things. And they need to know what tool stone they're going to be encountering on the landscape. And they need to kind of budget their time. How much use can they get out of this stuff, right? So I mentioned they'll have a specialist raw material use, and what I mean by that is that they're going to map on to certain very productive stone tool sources, stuff that gets them all the qualities they need, right? And then they can just kind of map onto those and hit those during their seasonal rounds. Right. So the other big assumption is that reductions in mobility, or that is increasing sedentism, staying around at a place for a long time is going to let you accumulate a lot more trash. That's just pretty straightforward. We see that in our own homes where junk accumulates, right? We got old papers and everything else that just seem to pile up. That's because we're living sedentary lifeways. Trust if we had to lug all this stuff around on our back, we'd be a lot more careful about picking up flyers and brochures. So those are the two basic assumptions. This is just a great illustration of how Fremont Lifeways it'll look. Some of the multiple different activities that people who are living in these settled lifeways, right? You're carrying out all these different activities on one site. So you're both farming and fishing and hunting, making baskets, making pottery, doing all these things. So not only are you accumulating more trash, but we should expect that they'll accumulate more types of trash, right? So to measure this, I'm looking at density, richness, and evenness. Density is pretty straightforward, just dividing the counts of artifacts by the amount of fill, right? And we expect that we'll have much more denser, a much denser occupation, a lot more material in more sedentary places, right? Richness, this is basically just a count of how many different artifact types are there. Or we could similarly do this with species. How many species are represented in these bones, right? And again, with increased sedentism, we expect to see more artifact types given more activities being carried out on site. Finally, evenness. This is just measuring if you have a number of artifact types, if you randomly sampled, what are the odds that it land in one class or another? So if you have 20 projectile points and 3 scrapers, that's not that even, right? But if you have 5 projectile points, 6 scrapers, 6 drills, that's where you have high richness, high evenness, right? So these are just some of my expectations. We don't really need to get into that too much, but basically the assumption is that richness and evenness and density all should increase with increased sedentism. We see increased sedentism through time up until about this period of about 1000 AD. in the regional prehistoric record. So we expect that that's what's happening here at Yampa Canyon. Um, but we're just going to have to test some of these things, right? So we're going to look at this with chipstone, look at this also with the species represented in the bones, um, the fauna there, right? As well as the groundstone tools. Right? Here we might see some uh, changes in the evenness, and this probably be related to special tools being used for horticultural subsistence and that. So here's just a overall schematic about how we'll be interpreting some of this stuff. So we're going to sort, once we get the density and diversity measures on all this stuff, we'll be sorting them basically like a percentile rank. Um, and we'll be sorting them into thirds. So we expect the highest density stuff to be top third of the deposits, right? Um, so we'll see if that checks out. If density is that high, we would also expect diversity of chipstone in this example to also be that high, right? So is density high? Is diversity high? Yes. Okay. You have a long-term occupation. Native folks were practicing a wide variety of activities on the site and leaving a lot of different kinds of trash behind, right? Okay, great. But what if you have high density, but relatively low diversity measures, right? Well, this may represent, this is where we get into the kind of qualitative interpretation. This may represent folks spending a lot of time at this site, perhaps seasonally, reoccupying the place, but for a very specific purpose. So when we look at, well, what artifact types are skewing these counts, right? Say, oh, we have a ton of projectile point bases. Okay, great. You got a hunting camp, right? That's where they're dehafting their weapons, reproducing new points, right? Or you have a lot of bone, but very few tools and things like this. Okay, great. This is where they were processing the game, right? So this is kind of how we'll be interpreting some of these things, right? So again, why is this important? Just wrap up with this whole idea. In the old world, they talk about the Neolithization, right? The Neolithic Revolution or the agricultural revolution, sedentary revolution, all these different names, right? This was first proposed by V. Gordon Child, that once folks got agriculture, they just couldn't help themselves but move into cities. And they just couldn't help themselves but start making ceramic and living real close and having these incredible stratified social hierarchies, right? And all of these other things. But is this true, right? Is this what we see in the New World? Is this what we see in the case of the Fremont and the adoption of corn agriculture there? Was it that prior to this, everybody was just traipsing around, totally mobile, untethered to any place? And then, oh, corn shows up, and man, I'm going to actually hang out here at Castle Park for the rest of my days. I'm going to start making ceramic, and I'm going to build some architecture. It's going to be really cool. It's going to be revolutionary, right? Or did this stuff not happen as a sweep, right? Can we see increasing sedentism in the record prior to this, right? Can we see evidence for other kind of cultural fluorescence prior to the arrival of corn farming and this, right? So this work is looking at that. It'll also help us get a grasp just on some of those regional point typologies and some of the just to help us refine some of the regional chronology for the region, which has otherwise been so heavily focused on those later Fremont Horizons. So this is the end of my presentation. I just want to thank everybody at CSU for all of their friendship and support. My committee there and some of my really good friends and colleagues there. I also want to thank University of Colorado Museum for their support. Um, Christina Kane, who is the curator there, has been totally supportive of this research and very open and welcoming to me. They've all really made me feel like family. Will Gregg, who's the archivist there, is just a heck of a guy, and he's really helped me root out a lot of these photos and go through these old journals and try to figure out some of this stuff. And Will Taylor is helping me with some of that faunal piece and selecting what bones to get these radiocarbon dates from. Um, also like to give thanks to all those who came before. It's my ancestors and my parents and all the archaeological mentors as well as the students and the staff who dug at this site and allowed me to now work it. And finally, some of the funding sources I've received, the Karen S. Greiner Fund, Alice Hamilton, and Eugene Eisenbarth Fund. They've all provided financial support for my research. So that is my presentation, and happy to take questions or anything else.
Thank you, Spencer. Yes, we're open for questions now for the next 10 to 15 minutes.
Larry, this is Harold
Yeah.
Henke. How you doing? Hey, I just wanted to say I enjoyed Spencer's presentation, but I also enjoyed him more as a tour guide up in Roberts Ranch. He was really great. So anyway, I just want to give a big shout out to that. It was a really great tour.
Oh, thank you, Harold. I knew I recognized you from somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah, your research is really interesting too. So
thank
you very much.
That was just crystal clear.
Spencer, was there a material source near there?
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of river cobbles that they're using. Pumpkin chert is the primary material that they're finding, so this really bright orange stuff. And later on in those later deposits, you definitely see folks favoring that material, where you'll have cores that still have the kind of river worn cortex on them there. So
Thank
good
you.
question, yeah.
I did have a question for you there, Spencer.
Yeah.
Or more a comment, I guess I should say. So I have come across blackened bone, like what you're talking about, in two circumstances. One, when bone has been thrown into like a hearth after the fire's gone out, and it's just sat in the charcoal for a really long time. The other one, it's in a midden that's full of charcoal. That's just had a ton of charcoal left with it. And it just ends up blackening it without it actually being burnt.
Oh, that could be.
Because like when you throw it into a midden and it just sits in that charcoal for ages, it just absorbs that charcoal color. And yeah, there has been thoughts that could also throw off radiocarbon dating on that bone when that's the case, because it's absorbing a bunch of that charcoal into the bone, into the porous bit of the bone. So yeah.
Okay, well, yeah, I'm gonna try to figure out where exactly, because yeah, that one pendant, like I say, it doesn't really look burnt, but it is blacker than heck.
Yeah. When it looks blacker than heck, like, but isn't burnt at all. Because like I definitely have come across where it's just like it looks like it's black. Like could not be any no other description but black, pure solid black, but not burnt at all. And you're like, what's done this? And it's because it's just sat in charcoal for a really long time.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, thank you for saying that. That is super useful, actually.
So like if it's gotten thrown out with a big deposit of ash from the fire, and it just sat in that ash for a long time, that'll do it.
Okay. Yeah, it's incredible the amount of bone modification they were doing there. I mean, just like I say, all these dice, all these pendants and blanks and awls. It's pretty neat. Yeah, whatever it was for,
Yeah, no, just this was more a comment because you had said it and you're like, I don't know why it's just this black. And I'm like, I've seen that before. That's something I've seen.
Yeah, thank you. That's super useful.
So fascinating talk. Thank you so much.
I was going to ask, what's with all the aggressive site names in the area? Is that, I thought you mentioned Hell's Canyon. Is that kind of the basis of it?
Yeah, exactly. And that was actually, Hell Canyon was named by Charlie Mantle, who was the rancher there. And one of the things, I wish I had it handy because I'd read it to y'all, but Chili Scoggin in his field journal, he would write these poems while he was out there. And one of them, he's writing about Charlie Mantle and how he's, one of the last man's man. And he's just this like incredible frontier figure doing the homesteading and all this. And one of the lines is about how like the finest thing he'd ever done was come in and name this canyon Hell.
Oh my.
Yeah. So I don't know exactly why. I mean, apparently it was favorable. I don't know. I mean,
Well,
they lived there for 60 years, so not sure why he named it that.
okay. My other thing is more of a comment. Those profile walls. If I in those photos, if I
Yeah.
had presented profile walls like that, no,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but whatever.
Yeah, OSHA wasn't paying too close attention, I guess.
Well, there's that too. Yeah. But I was just if my walls were not smooth, I heard about it. You also, I saw on your slide what was the name of that guy? Pat Lynch?
Yeah.
What was the name? A shopping list?
Yeah.
What was on it?
I think you cut out, but I'm assuming you asked what was on the shopping list.
Yes. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, he talks about buying some gunpowder. Like I say, he was manufacturing bullets on site. A big bag of flour and a big bag of coffee. I don't know why when you have only 3 things to buy, how you're going to forget that. It wasn't like some gourmet recipe he was cooking up, but yeah, that's what was on it.
Okay. And when you said he was manufacturing bullets, like what's the evidence of that there?
So they had a lot of casings there, empty casings, and then a lot of lead just kind of found within the sediments.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not big on gun manufacture. That's the way that Lister interpreted that stuff.
Mm-hmm. Were there any primers?
I don't know offhand.
Okay. Well, and honestly, I mean, I don't know, and this is getting way down the nerdy historic rabbit hole because I don't know if it's just rimfire ammunition versus center fire or what have you. But yeah, if it's center fire ammunition and no primers, that would be weird. But yeah, something to look into, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, if anybody's interested in Pat Lynch, there's a big the Park Service has a big page um, that has photos of him and like one of his old camps that was discovered in the 50s inside one of these caves. It's pretty cool. I mean, a lot of it, it's graffiti, I guess, at one point if it's written in Anglo script, but oh, it's cool seeing Pat Lynch and all these ships all over the place.
That is really neat. Yeah. Is it the same ship or is it different ships?
That's a good question. Yeah.
Huh. Interesting. Yeah. Maybe he just likes ships.
Yeah, right.
I think the last thing I had was just what piqued my interest was you talking about seeing evidence of both bow and arrow and atlatl use concurrently, and you mentioned like some other sites and whatnot. Like what does that look like at other sites, and what have other people kind of seen at sites where that is happening?
Yeah, I'm to be honest, I'm not real familiar with that switch in kind of the Western Slope, Great Basin, Colorado Plateau. I've read a little bit about that, like in the plains, like in the far western, northwestern plains, where apparently bow and arrow shows up with Avonlea points, and atlatl is just out the window. You just basically stop using it entirely. Um, a lot of people tie that to warfare and different stuff like that was happening at the time. I don't know. It would be interesting to see what the record actually is in the Colorado Plateau. But to be honest, I don't have that offhand.
Yeah, no, but I just thought that was really interesting. It's just something to like have the opportunity to work on a site where it's just like, oh, there's this really interesting kind of transitional thing going on. Sounds really neat. So sounds like you
Yeah.
got a lot of interesting things to really go down different rabbit holes.
For sure, yeah, and I'm having to limit myself. I hope like 5 other theses come out of this Hells Midden site because there's a lot more to be done with it.
I mean, you could get a PhD out of this, let's be honest.
Yeah.
Yeah, for real. Well, cool. Does anyone else have any questions?
Yeah, this is Harold. Since I'm an avocational archaeologist, 2 questions. One, where is this stuff curated? I guess it's at CU. And then secondly, I think Chili Scoggins deserves like a whole chapter in your master's thesis.
Yeah. Yeah, Chili is just an incredible figure. I mean, to think that this guy was like in his 20s doing all this stuff. He and Ed actually both had worked previously at the Lindenmeyer site under Frank Roberts. And
Yes.
it seems to be like that's how they knew each other. And I think they spent 5 seasons there, and so they were there longer than anybody except for Frank Roberts. Like they really were at that site a long time. And yeah, he's just so fascinating. Reading his journals and all of his writings, he's so eloquent. He has the best handwriting. I don't want to talk bad on his provenience data for Hell's Midden. I'm sure it existed at some point, and Robert Berg did something with it. I don't know. But yeah, Chili Scoggin is just an incredible figure. And then to your first question, Harold, yes, it is all curated at CU, at their museum there. So I've been spending a couple days a week down in Boulder, looking at this collection, and yeah, it's just incredible.
Well, actually, what I should say is, I think it's awesome you're doing your work on an existing collection. That was something that I think a lot of people don't like to do that because they're like, oh, I don't get to dig my own site or whatever.
Right.
But it's something that I was encouraged to do when I was younger because I worked for a place that had a repository and they did encourage that. And I'm just really happy to see that actually happening these days, like to a really large extent, which I think is really cool. So
yeah, definitely. Well, yeah, I mean, working with these repositories, I mean, you know that they don't want to be accepting a bunch more stuff that you're finding, and those mid-century cowboys, man, were finding so much, and too much of it has just never been properly reported on, or hasn't been, this one has been reported on, but the updates that you could get with these new methods, getting the absolute dates and things like that, I mean, it's just so valuable. But yeah, I think ethically, you almost have to be doing that stuff now.
Yeah, for sure.
Because I'd botch something if I went out in the field.
Yeah.
Yeah, Chris.
Yeah, I ended up with another question for you in there with all the background you have on these individuals and like the provenience and all of that. How much of that are you going to end up using in trying to understand how what they did, the provenience, how they interpreted the material impacted kind of wider understandings of the Fremont period and other periods in the region based on what they were pulling out of that site? Like, are you evaluating any of their influence on kind of a broader area, or that site's influence on a broader area of interpretation, and kind of in the value of reinterpreting the site and kind of reanalyzing the data? Is that part of what you're going to try and do?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I don't think it was unique to these folks, but just the kind of theoretical underpinnings of the stuff at the time, it was all this culture history stuff. Noel Morris was the first one to identify the Fremont in the late 20s, 1929, I think, along the Fremont River in Utah. And from that time until really about the mid 70s, Fremont was just conceived as this like southwestern backwater cousins, like the Pueblo and periphery, and these folks who really didn't have much of their own thing going on. They just kind of borrowed some traits from further south, you know, and now a lot of that's been reevaluated. And I don't know, I'm personally more interested in I mean, Fremont does interest the heck out of me, but it almost seems too huge and kind of too enigmatic for me to even like touch that closely. So I'll talk about that somewhat, but I'm really more intrigued in like figuring out what are these archaic and like pre-formative deposits. What are they representing in that kind of sequence of culture change? But yeah, it gets hairy. I mean, Fremont's just weird because we don't have, descendant communities who are really speaking up about it. We don't have a good sense. Everybody talks about the Fremont, disappearance or the collapse or this, and it's not really clear what's causing some of that stuff. So I'm going to try to stay away from that, Chris, to be honest.
Fair enough. That leads, I mean, I guess it leads to another question in there that I was just wondering out of it. Did they ever reach the bottom of the deposits? Like actually truly know they reached the bottom of the deposits, or did they just hit some sterile layers and stop?
Yeah, that's a great question. They definitely got to below the present floodplain. So my thinking is that maybe if there was stuff below that it is just so jumbled up because they're kind of on this alluvial terrace you saw where all that modern farming was being done. So they definitely got below that surface. And they did hit dry. What's below that? Yeah, I mean that is a good question. I don't know that the integrity would be there because it was just all this pretty clearly alluvial fill at that point. Yeah.
Okay. It was just interesting, like, they stopped digging, but it didn't look like they'd hit bedrock or something that was saying, yeah, you can't dig any further here. The stop can't go down any deeper. So
yeah,
just wondering, whether they reached actual bottom or did they just stop because they hit something that said, don't have anything else. This should be the end.
Yeah, right. I'm sure it just at one point it got so complicated going up on that and then over the ditch and then back down.
Of course. I mean, yeah, just was wondering.
No, that's a great question. Yeah.
So are there any more questions before we sign off? I want to thank you again, Spencer, for a wonderful presentation.
Oh, yes.
I'll be in contact with you. I've got a couple questions that I want to ask you off via email.
Okay. And I just dropped my email in the chat just in case you all have done like so much stimulating my thinking here, and I really appreciate the feedback and all of that. So yeah, if folks want to reach out, feel free to do that. And hopefully I'll have results someday. We'll get back to y'all on that. Yeah. Do a part 2.
We'd love to have you back when you do it, for real.
We'll invite you back.
Okay, great.
So I want to thank everyone who attended tonight's chapter meeting, and I hope you stay warm and safe. And that's all I have.
Thank you, Larry, and thanks everybody for being here.
Thank you, Spencer.
Thank you, Spencer.
Thanks, bye.
Thanks, Spencer. Great presentation.